A very warm welcome to part 2 of my XXL Altcoin Ranking video September edition. As you probably already noticed from part 1, we've already covered the first altcoins in the ranking. Now in today's video, we're definitely continuing with the next batch down here. I actually don't want to beat around the bush too much today. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss part 3 under any circumstances. Of course, also feel free to activate the bell, like, and comment, especially for the loyal viewers among you. Otherwise, just a very quick recap. I know I keep repeating myself, but here's a quick disclaimer again. This is, of course, not financial advice, and also an important note, everything is based on my personal opinion. I'm not being paid and have no financial relationship with any of these altcoin projects. I also went into detail about that in the last video. It's extremely important for me to mention this because especially on YouTube, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, but I want to be completely transparent here. Later, when it comes to the actual ranking, I also want to be fully transparent about which altcoins I personally invest in, what my personal opinion is, and so on. So as I said, full transparency here. Otherwise, as I said, be extremely careful, especially with low cap projects. Such projects definitely carry the risk of going all the way down to zero or suffering heavy losses, so make sure you have clear risk management in place. Above all, have a solid core in your portfolio. It's extremely important to have Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, etc., the usual classics, in your own portfolio, so you at least have some degree of stability. And finally, once again, do your own research. I definitely recommend this video here for that. There, I went into great detail about how you can use ChatGPT with the new agent to conduct your own altcoin analyses. It's highly fascinating and also gives you as viewers a certain independence from my opinion in today's video. That's all I have to say on that for now. Today, I want to jump straight into the content, so let's get right to the next altcoin, which is SUI, a real classic and definitely a part of my own portfolio. I've also mentioned several times on YouTube that it's one of my favorite altcoins. I've repeatedly bought more at this point, especially around the $2 mark, give or take. Current market cap is 11 billion. The tokenomics, it has to be said, are not entirely optimal. We have to be very clear about the fact that there is still some inflation coming to this project, but even so, I see extremely strong developments happening in the background. We can take a look at some current statistics here. Also, from an on-chain perspective, things are looking extremely good. At this point, we have an enormously high volume. We have an increased total value locked, hitting one all-time high after another. We're building on a very, very solid foundation here, and that's why I really like SUI. That should definitely be mentioned, despite the only average tokenomics at this point. But apart from that, we have an extremely good overall package here. All listings are also included. We already have the Binance listing, which is, of course, especially retail friendly as it brings in the broader public, and that's why, quite clearly, this is logically a blue chip project. We'll talk about the ranking in a moment. Just briefly, in case you're wondering what my current plan is, I'm definitely holding my SUI, at least until the next all-time high. I also have significantly higher price targets here of $10 and more. Definitely. That's definitely my current approach. Otherwise, if you're considering doing some more DCA here, meaning potential additional purchases, you can definitely do that in my opinion. If the price drops into the range of $2.50, so roughly around here, in my opinion, it's reasonable again to potentially make additional purchases. To be completely honest with you, I probably won't do it myself because I already have a relatively good entry price. As I said, this is just speaking from the perspective of someone who doesn't have any position in SUI yet. In my view, in a trend like this, it's definitely legitimate to start building long positions here, possibly with a tight stop loss below. These are all options you could consider, or perhaps even set up a new long trading bot. That's definitely my current approach. Apart from that, we also have positive momentum here in the KVBSO. If you're wondering, hey Vincent, what kind of indicators are those? They're my own. I've also explained in the video description how each of you can get completely free access to my indicator set. That's all I have to say about that for now. In my opinion, it's a very, very clear decision. It definitely belongs in the blue chip category, so it's clearly represented up here. We can also arrange the rankings so that I sort everything here in order, basically from very good to good in this case, so we can continue like that if you want. Otherwise, let's move on to the second altcoin in today's video. It's actually a meme coin, so it's the biggest meme after Dogecoin. In my opinion, Pepe is extremely retail friendly. That's why I included it as well. In my view, it's also a kind of slightly leveraged bet on Ethereum. Every time I've seen Ethereum show relative strength, we've also seen Pepe deliver a good performance. Here too, it quickly did a 2x. Again, we saw good performance here. Of course, everyone has to decide for themselves whether they even want to get into meme coins. Still, if a potential meme coin rally does happen, especially when the general public jumps in again, in my view, it's a good opportunity. Here as well, we're currently getting relatively good support again. So from a purely technical chart perspective, it would now be legitimate to start building small positions here. Otherwise, in the worst case scenario, the price will definitely be around $0.05, so roughly in that price range. You have to keep in mind, we're talking about a meme coin here. Something like this can of course potentially crash by 30 or 40% again. Please be aware of this, and obviously there's no use case or anything similar here. But still, betting a little on the broad masses, if a lot of retail investors come back here again, I can definitely imagine that there could be another good performance. That's why I'm personally not invested, but it's definitely still on my watch list. It could even soon be a potential buy or represent a potential buying opportunity. Still, at the moment, I'm personally just observing, and that's definitely my current approach. Now let's move on to the next altcoin, which I've already talked about before, namely Inspect. In this case, it's a kind of layer 2 for Bit and Sotao. We're talking here about a Bit and Sotao subnet, which is still completely at the beginning. In this case, we're dealing with a rebranding. Back then, I remember very well, it was a kind of Twitter extension, and just a few months ago there was a rebranding here, which I really liked. We also have a new logo here now. Back then, we still had this logo. Now, in any case, it's all about a Bit and Sotao subnet, which I really like a lot, because personally, as you all know, I'm very bullish on Bit and Sotao. That's why I can easily imagine that the current trend with Inspect will continue to grow, especially since the marketing here is really top-notch. There's really been a lot going on, and when it comes to listings, they're definitely delivering. It also shows a certain level of liquidity. We recently got a Bitpanda listing here, which in my opinion is definitely a positive sign, especially if a crypto project can afford listings even in the current market phase. That's why it's definitely a project that's currently on my watch list. I'm keeping a close eye on it at the moment. To be honest, I'm not really buying more right now. I want to wait and see how the current structure develops first. Maybe if it drops to 20 cents, you could consider building an initial position. Of course, it's also extremely high risk with just a 23 million market cap. You know, it's the usual game at this point, but still, it's definitely interesting. Especially if the big blue chip project, meaning Bit and Sotao, performs well. I can easily imagine that all these SAP networks will benefit from it as well. That's why it's definitely interesting. We see token unlocks here, so there's still something coming our way. So there is definitely still some inflation coming our way, but the majority is already in circulation. So about 80% is already out there, 23 million, and in this case, 29 million is fully diluted. That's why it's definitely fine for a low cap project. So I would definitely rate the whole thing as neutral. At this point, it's not catastrophic, but it's also not perfect, not ideal. There are better tokenomics with low cap projects, but still, all in all, it's a nice solid overall package that you definitely shouldn't lose sight of. That's why I personally have it on my watch list. Otherwise, the next project is Fetch.ai, which we can take a look at now. Actually, every one of you should know it as well. Back then, there was this merger of the bigger AI projects. I remember that very well. And that's when we basically got a kind of rebranding as well. Current market cap is 1.4 billion and the tokenomics are fine here too. We can take a look and you can see that most of the tokens are already in circulation at this point. We can see here that the last remaining tokens are slowly but surely coming onto the market, but by early 2026 everything will be fully released. That's why we definitely don't need to worry much about inflation here. In my opinion, that was also kind of the main sticking point for this project, which is why we saw a bit of a drop here, at least as far as the chart is concerned. To be honest, the chart looks a bit weak to me. I don't particularly like it. All in all, it's definitely a candidate you need to keep an eye on. Still, always ask yourself this question here, or rather, I personally always ask myself, if I had capital available right now, would I rather invest in Bit and Sotao or in Fetch.ai? And in that case, my personal decision would definitely be Bit and Sotao. So I definitely see more potential in Bit and Sotao, even though the tokenomics are a bit worse than I do in Fetch.ai. But still, I personally assume that we will see another good performance here. If we take a look at the chart here as well, we see levels from December 2024 at $2. At times, we even had levels at $3, and I can definitely imagine that we'll revisit these areas again during a proper altcoin season. Whether we'll see significantly new all-time highs here, well, that's something we definitely have to wait and see because the hype was already extremely high. So I can also easily imagine that new AI projects will come onto the market as a result. But still, Fetch.ai has established itself, it's definitely well represented as an all-around package, and that's why it's solid. Yes, it's basically a solid project where you really can't find any major negative points. But otherwise, in my opinion, it's currently only on my watch list. It's not a top-tier blue-chip project where I would say it absolutely has to be at the core of one's own portfolio. That's kind of the point of this blue-chip category. It's definitely also my personal core in my own portfolio where I say, okay, these are really projects you can more or less rely on, even though you always have to be careful when talking about altcoins, because at the end of the day, anything can happen. But still, these are definitely the projects in this top category that also make up the core of my own portfolio. So now you definitely know about that. Now let's continue with the next project, which is Clearpool. This one is definitely very exciting at this point because in my opinion, it's one of the best RWA projects out there that is real-world assets. We currently see a market cap of 130 million here. So it's still significantly smaller than Ondo, for example. In my opinion, it's a good competitor to Ondo. Of course, Ondo is in a completely different league. Yes, so it's kind of like the little brother, but all in all, I still like it a lot. We can take a look at the tokenomics here. Here we definitely have the big advantage that almost everything is already in circulation. We can see here that all the seed rounds, the team rounds, etc. are all fully unlocked. So to sum it up, anyone who wanted to sell has definitely already sold by now. That's why there's definitely a very good, healthy foundation here. If you're now asking yourself, okay, hey, where are the remaining 30 million in market cap when you look at the practical ratio between market cap and full dilution? There are definitely still a few coins that are locked at this point, but for me personally, it's important that especially all the pre-seed rounds, that is, all the people who had early access and bought the coin at extremely low prices, or the team for example, are now fully unlocked. For me personally, it's extremely important that other investors don't just completely dump on me if I decide to buy in now. That's why the tokenomics are definitely solid here. Otherwise, the listings are also very strong, which I really like, especially for a project of this size. If we take a look at the whole thing, it's also worth mentioning that this project has been around for a while. Of course, the overall chart actually looks rather disastrous, to be honest. But still, when I look at the current chart here, it actually looks relatively good. We'll move on to the analysis in a moment, where I'll share my current strategy, as I said, for the sake of transparency. So, I am personally invested in Clearpole, which I see as a cool alternative to Ondo. I'm also personally invested in Ondo, but that's about it. So when it comes to the topic of RWA, I have to say, in my opinion, it's relatively scarce. We can take a look. I've put together a sort of RWA watch list from my side, and I have to be honest, when I look at all the competing projects here, there really aren't any major players in the RWA sector, even though overall I'm extremely bullish on RWA. So people definitely know this, especially the loyal viewers among you, but to be honest, all these projects, sure, Inrio could still be interesting, or some of the smaller ones here, but again, to be honest, or even a prop chain, sure, could theoretically be interesting, but for me personally, it's almost too risky, especially with RWA projects. I'd rather bet on the blue chips, on the big players, where at least to some extent I can be sure that the projects are established, that there are strong partnerships. So I really want a certain level of security there, especially in the RWA sector, which is of course extremely driven by institutions. In my opinion, it's much harder for an RWA project to establish itself than, for example, a meme coin or an AI coin or anything else. Especially with a narrative like AI agents or something similar, it can happen pretty quickly that an AI project reaches a market cap of $1 billion. But I'll put it this way. In the RWA sector, it's much more difficult because investors look very closely at whether there's real substance. Do we have strong partnerships here? Are there real applications? So as an RWA project, you really can't just sneak by. There really has to be something substantial on offer, and that's why I have to say the competition is actually weak. And that's why, personally, when it comes to RWAs, I have Ondo in my portfolio, I have Clearpool in my portfolio. There's also a third RWA project, which we'll talk about later. I'm still considering that one at the moment, but for now, those are my only two players. As I said, we can also take a look at the website here. The entire Clearpool project also covers the stablecoin narrative. So, the stablecoin narrative is definitely very interesting and very important in this cycle, and we can clearly see that real use is happening here, that a lot is actually taking place on chain, and for me personally, it's extremely important that we have strong partnerships and that there's truly a good team behind it. And that's why it's especially important to me with these kinds of RWA projects that there is real substance behind them. Let's take another look at what the current chart is doing. Here we have extremely strong support at 8 US cents. I also mentioned several times on YouTube that I made a significant entry there. Otherwise, at the current moment, we definitely have a pretty nice structure, higher interim lows with higher interim highs. I definitely like that quite a lot as well. Now you definitely have to keep an eye on what the chart is doing. In my opinion, potential increases could be seen again at 12 to 13 US cents. It would definitely be interesting to maybe add another position here at the lower edge. Otherwise, I'm already quite satisfied with my position here. That's why you really have to keep a close watch on it here. I would classify it as a potential buy if we return to certain price ranges here. Currently, I'm not doing anything with Clearpole, as I already mentioned, for the sake of transparency. I am invested here, but otherwise you could potentially add to your position as a potential buy if certain price ranges are reached again. That's definitely the current plan here. Otherwise, let's move on to the next project, which is OpenServe, a project I've actually known practically since day one. Let's take a look at it here. The truly loyal viewers among you will definitely remember. Back then, I made the video somewhere here, or rather, I think I announced it somewhere on Telegram and then made a YouTube video about it. So we were definitely able to achieve a good performance there. Of course, we also got hit really hard again at that point, which has to be clearly mentioned, but still, this is a highly interesting project, especially when you compare the current developments to the current market cap. Right now, we have a market cap of just 46 million, fully diluted 69 million. Of course, that's not entirely optimal, but there is still a clear vesting phase here. So on the one hand, we still have to expect some inflation, but it's not particularly high or extreme. It's definitely still within the green zone as far as the ratio itself is concerned. The chart looks extremely good, I have to say. There are hardly any listings yet. We're still right at the very beginning with this project. We can take a look at the whole thing using the website and the Twitter profile. At the end of the day, it's about AI agents, essentially a complete protocol, an entire AI agent ecosystem that we have here, which in my opinion operates in a highly professional manner for its respective size. Of course, I don't want to talk it up too much at this point. At the end of the day, we're talking about a complete low-cap project here. You have to be extremely careful. You need to be cautious, especially with new candidates who haven't been through a cycle yet. But here on Twitter, they're definitely delivering. I really like the marketing a lot, and I'm also very pleased with all the progress that's been made. So I've also been following it throughout the entire summer, and that's why we have a very positive and strong chart here with correspondingly higher interim lows and higher interim highs. That's why in any case we have a clear relative strength here. I really like it a lot, especially for a project of this size. We're talking about a low-cap project here. And especially with low-cap projects, it has to be said very clearly that a lot of charts look really disastrous, but here it's actually the opposite. And it's actually similar to Taobot, if you remember, where we also had a very, very strong chart. That's exactly how it currently looks here with OpenSurf as well. That's why I personally definitely want to buy more here if we reach certain price levels again. And to be completely honest here, even though I really like the project, I wouldn't want to buy in just yet. When I look at the whole thing here, it definitely goes against my rules to buy in again now because you could definitely get burned here. Let's take a look at what the intermediate level is here. The intermediate level would theoretically be almost minus 40%, and you really have to keep that in mind here. We're talking here about a highly volatile low-cap coin, so you definitely have to be especially careful. But if certain price ranges are reached again, and if, in this case, the upward structure continues to develop, it looks extremely, extremely good that we could see something like this happen, which could then lead to new all-time highs. So all in all, I'm definitely feeling really positive about this. At the moment, I wouldn't buy in yet. It's still a bit too risky, but if you're aware of the risk and in addition believe in the AI agent hype, it's definitely a good option to consider adding to your portfolio. That's why I'm definitely feeling positive about it, and if certain price ranges are reached, it's definitely a potential buy from my side. As I said, you definitely have to be aware of the risk. There are also alternatives in the AI agent sector that are already a bit more established, for example, Virtual's protocol. We'll talk about that later, but still, it's definitely a candidate you need to keep an eye on, and it becomes interesting again in certain price ranges to potentially build positions. That's all I have to say about that for now. Let's continue with the next project, which is also the last RWA project on today's list, Pinlink. Someone from my community actually asked me about it during my livestream, wanting to know my personal opinion. We saw an incredibly strong pump here during the November-December rally, so there was really a lot of hype, at least in the short term. Here we also shot up to $3.40 in the short term. Now in this case, we've seen some significant profit taking. Of course, that was also due to the overall market situation. Now we have a relatively solid core group of investors here. That's actually a good sign that the price is currently stabilizing at around 50 US cents. So it definitely looks like a core group of investors is slowly but surely forming here. Otherwise, the tokenomics are definitely in the green zone as well. Here we have a market cap of 51 million and a fully diluted valuation of 58 million. If we take a look at the listings here, there's already quite a bit on offer. So for the current size, I definitely like it quite a lot. There's a special feature here, basically a clear unique selling point. We have the combination of two narratives here. On the one hand, RWA combined with DePIN. Pinlink is the first RWA token as a DePIN platform, which is definitely a unique selling point that could also provide some momentum. So we have the DePIN narrative, decentralized infrastructure, for example Render, for example Akash Network, and in this case, the whole thing is combined with RWA. It's definitely very interesting. There's definitely a lot on offer here as well. For me personally, it's always very important that the marketing delivers, that we have strong partnerships, and that there's real substance behind it, so everyone can form their own opinion about it. There's already quite a lot in place, which I personally really like. But still, I want to make it very clear here. There is definitely still a high level of risk involved, simply because this is an RWA project that is still very, very small. And especially with RWA, as I mentioned earlier, it's significantly more difficult to establish yourself because most RWA projects are based on creating infrastructure to tokenize assets, and especially when it comes to infrastructure projects, there are usually large monopolies. We have big projects like Ondo, for example, and that's why it's especially difficult for newcomers to establish themselves. That's why it's definitely a double-edged sword. You definitely have to be careful. We have both the risk and, of course, the potential. As we've seen, the liquidity isn't particularly high either. So even a moderately small altcoin rally, combined perhaps with a bit of RWA hype, can quickly send things up by 6, 7, or even 8 times. But as I said, the risk is just as present here. That's why for me, it's definitely a candidate for high risk at high reward. Personally, I'm not invested. Personally, in the RWA sector, I'm only invested in Ondo and Clearpool, but still, you have to keep an eye on it. it could potentially make a comeback because, as I said, there is some substance there. The marketing is there. Purely from a narrative perspective, everything fits as well. But as I said, the downside here is definitely that you have to be careful, especially with newcomers in the RWA sector. They first have to prove themselves. They first have to establish themselves. We have extremely strong competition in this sector. That's why you definitely need to be cautious. That's all for now on this topic. Otherwise, the next project, CookieDAO, is in this case an AI agent. Ecosystem is therefore the little brother of Virtual's protocol. Of course, at the end of the day, everything depends on the AI agent hype. We can take a look at the chart here. The chart itself looks reasonably okay. We experienced an extreme hype here. During the November-December rally, we were punished just as quickly in return. So, let me put it this way. The problem, or rather the reality, with especially new narratives is that things come and go extremely quickly. That's why you have to be particularly careful there. Just like with Virtual's protocol, in general, with these AI agent projects, the turnover is relatively high. It can also easily happen that even if such a hype comes back, new projects will establish themselves again, especially when it comes to infrastructure. And here, we definitely have an infrastructure project, and it's quite common that usually only 1 or 2 really good projects become established, while the rest have an extremely hard time when it comes to infrastructure. That's why you really need to think twice before deciding to invest here. We can take a look at the whole thing with the token unlocks. Here, we definitely have to expect a certain amount of inflation as well. Especially the team here, if you click on it, you can see that they're only now really starting to receive their distributions. So you have to be very aware that there is still some selling pressure here, which of course affects the project. And that's why we can see here, slowly but surely, even if maybe no one is actively selling, even if there's a clear core group of investors, we still see a slight bleed to the downside. Simply because a certain amount of inflation is hitting the project, and as a result, the token price is being diluted. That's why you definitely need to be a bit careful here, in my opinion. It's definitely another one of those high risk, high reward things. For me personally, it's always on my current watch list. I personally keep a very close eye on it because if another AI agent hype comes back, I definitely want to have a position in cookies. So in my opinion, it's definitely a top opportunity to find an entry point here again. But as I said, everything ultimately depends on the bigger picture, and personally, I'll talk more about this later, I'm also invested in economic protocols, so I'm relatively satisfied here. And at this point, I also have other candidates in the AI agent sector, for example, something like OpenSurf. So in that case, I would rather go for a project like that if certain prices are met, rather than in the case of CookieStar. Nevertheless, on the other hand, it has to be said that they are still delivering. We already have the finance listing, which of course benefits the project since all the liquidity gateways are now open. So that's also something extremely positive to take note of. But as I said, we definitely have to keep a close eye on the topics of inflation and token unlocks, and that's why, in my opinion, it's justifiably a watchlist candidate. Now let's move on to the next project, which is XRP. I included it for the XRP fanboys since I often get the question, hey Vincent, what's your opinion on XRP? So let's take a look at the chart here. At this point, I don't even want to talk about the technology or anything else. You're probably already flooded with XRP news videos on YouTube. There are some YouTubers who only report on XRP, so the community is really extremely strong behind it. It's actually a positive sign that there's such a cult-like community behind it. That is definitely the unique selling point or the big advantage of XRP, and that's also why the chart is holding up so well, because the core group of investors is extremely loyal. Everyone thinks XRP will go to $10, $20, $100 or something like that, and that's why, looking at the chart, you really have to give XRP a lot of credit. A strong relative strength. So I really like that a lot, purely from a technical analysis perspective, that there's truly a stable core of investors here. And you can also see this reflected here if you take a look at it on TradingView. At the moment we're cooling off a bit, but that's pretty natural after such a pump. If we also look here at my indicator, the KVBSO, we currently have negative momentum as well. So I can easily imagine that we might test certain Fibonacci levels again here. Maybe the 0.382 level, or perhaps even in this case the 0.5 Fibonacci level. So that could potentially offer new entry opportunities. Personally, I'm not invested in XRP and I don't plan to be. The only thing I do is set up long trading bots. Especially for trading bots, XRP is relatively relaxed because we usually have nice price ranges here. And overall, the chart looks relatively healthy, and that of course benefits a trading bot. Otherwise, what you can also do with XRP is build up long positions. So for me personally, it's much more interesting to say I'll open new long positions here, or in this case at the 0.5 Fibonacci level, which is almost exactly at $2. You could also build new long positions here. So for me, that's much more interesting than making an investment here and only then taking the exit. So I'd rather go for other altcoins. In my opinion, other altcoins have a better risk-reward ratio than XRP. Especially on a larger scale, a lot has already happened with XRP. So trying to fill your pockets here at just under $3 is in my view grossly negligent. Yes, I also know many of my colleagues who have been invested here since 40 US cents. They've all already taken significant profits here. So you really have to keep in mind that if you're buying in now, you're buying in at an extremely high price. So I'm not saying that we've already seen the tops here, I can still easily imagine that we could see a 3, 4, or maybe even 5 times increase here. Yes, it's quite possible that we could even reach $10, but for me, the risk-reward ratio still isn't quite optimal. That's why long positions are personally fine for me, but making big additional purchases now doesn't make sense. I also don't have it in my own portfolio. It's still a blue chip project, so it still belongs in the top category, simply because it has already established itself. That's why it's definitely in good hands here. Let's move on to the next project. It's actually another meme coin. I just want to mention it briefly. Someone from my community requested it and asked for my opinion. If we take a look at it, I've made some interesting observations because the chart itself is very, very interesting. As I said, at the end of the day, it's a complete meme coin. Investing in it is pure gambling. You can't even really call it investing. Right now, the market cap is only 25 million. Still, what really stood out to me is that every time Ethereum performs well and shows relative strength, we also see Book of Ethereum quickly doing almost a 3x. That's happening again now. We see it going from 10 cents up to 34 cents in the short term. So things move pretty quickly here. I also notice right now that we're getting good volume coming in, so I can really imagine that we might see another strong performance here. It's basically a kind of leveraged bet on Ethereum. At the moment, Ethereum is already close to a new all-time high, but in this case, the meme coin is still lagging a bit behind. So it's definitely a nice leveraged bet you can take advantage of. But of course, this is pure gambling and clearly falls into the lottery ticket category. It's extremely high risk, so I would only go in with play money here if at all. With a solid strategy, it could pay off. For example, if you immediately pull out your initial investment after a 2x or something similar. But as I said, I just wanted to mention it briefly. I'm also not being paid by the project or anything like that, but someone from my community asked me about it, and I actually find it somewhat interesting because the chart looks relatively clean. We have a nice reactivity to Ethereum, so I can definitely imagine that we could easily reach 100 million market cap or more here. That's all I have to say about that for now. Otherwise, let's move on to the next project, which is Solana. I just wanted to touch on it briefly as well, because in my opinion, Solana is also relatively interesting again at the moment. Personally, I'm definitely more of an Ethereum fan. In my opinion, Ethereum has a much stronger reason to exist, because at the end of the day, if we're being honest, Solana is 90% dependent on all those pump and fun stories and whatever they're called. That's why I wouldn't say I'm skeptical, but you really have to keep in mind here. It's a retailer chain. At the end of the day, a lot here depends on the general public, whether meme coins are being traded again or not. But still, you can make good trades here as well, because structurally speaking, and in terms of the current fundamentals, things are absolutely not looking bad here either. We're seeing new all-time highs in total value locked, and the stablecoin supply is also looking good. The current volume here is also fine. If we take a closer look, this is, I would say, an important chart. Because for me personally, when I ask myself the question, is Solana currently a good investment, or how heavily should I weight it in my own portfolio? It always comes down to the question of its dependency on Ethereum. With this chart, we can see quite clearly how Solana is performing relative to Ethereum. Since 2023, we've seen an incredibly strong performance in this case. We've all noticed how strong the narrative around meme coins has been, especially due to stories like Pump Fun, etc. And that's why we've seen a clear outperformance of Solana compared to Ethereum. Everyone claimed, especially in these circles, that Ethereum is dead. Why should I even hold Ethereum? Etc. And actually, if we look here, since April 2025, we've seen a clear underperformance of Solana compared to Ethereum. And that's why you really need to keep a very close eye on this chart. In my opinion, personally, I'm definitely of the view that this trend will continue for now. Here too, the saying clearly applies. The trend is your friend until the very end. So for now, I'm just going to wait and see how the current behavior continues to play out. In my opinion, Ethereum is about to start its run. Ethereum will head for new all-time highs, which will of course also benefit all the altcoins running on the Ethereum chain. Still, as I said, the downtrend is clearly present. So for now, I would wait until a clear trend reversal happens here, and then it could become interesting again to say at certain price levels, okay, now I'm going to shift my Ethereum into Solana, or vice versa. So in this case, I always want to act counter-cyclically. If, for example, we reach levels again where Solana is favorable relative to Ethereum, it might make sense to shift the Ethereum you have in your portfolio into Solana. So you really have to keep a close eye on the trend. But at the moment, we have a clear downtrend here, and right now I would be reluctant to exchange my Ethereum for Solana. That's why I'm currently satisfied that Ethereum is my largest position, significantly larger than Solana. Still, Solana could become interesting again if certain levels are reached here. Especially within this structure, I can easily imagine focusing more on Solana again, but that's just my current opinion. So, Solana is definitely a clear blue chip project. Of course, we could also include it right behind Ethereum, but at the moment the chips are definitely more heavily weighted towards Ethereum, and the current relative strength clearly favors Ethereum as well. All the utility projects and so on are also running on Ethereum. Solana is clearly a retailer chain, it's dependent on meme coins, and that's a major reason why I don't necessarily need to hold a lot of Solana in my portfolio right now. I do have long trading bots and so on running as well, so I'm definitely optimistic too, but at the moment I still see more potential in Ethereum. Otherwise, the next project we're going to talk about is another AI project. Some of you might still know it, Paul AI, which is also being heavily promoted by Alex Becker, among others. If I take a look at the chart here, we've also seen a strong pump here, just like with many AI projects. There was a strong rally, especially in November and December 2024, but now it has bled out again significantly, and we're currently seeing a nice bottoming phase. So we've been present here for a very, very long time already. Between 7 and 9 US cents is, in my opinion, a bottoming area. To be completely honest with you, I find it very, very difficult to assess how strongly a project like this could bounce back. Overall, if you look at the big picture here as a complete package, the tokenomics are fine and the narrative is there. So AI is also very good, considering what we currently have here. The developments are also fine. Partnerships and marketing are also fine. Although I have to say, in terms of the frequency of individual posts, it could definitely be better. So the fact that they sometimes go several days without posting is definitely something I don't like. But still, I would say in terms of the foundation we have here, we have good partnerships and we already have a certain history established. We've also already managed to get through some tough phases in the meantime. So there was a community voting at one point. That's why we also see this sharp crash here. And of course, something like that leaves scars on a project. But still, the longer the track record, the better, of course. Still, this is a bit of a 50-50 situation. Personally, I have it on my watch list. I'm currently keeping an eye on it, but I'm not invested. Personally, I see better alternatives in the AI sector at the moment, but still, if you're convinced by the project, the current prices are definitely very attractive. If a comeback happens, that's all for now on that topic. Now let's talk about the next AI project, namely Zignali. I've mentioned it several times before on my YouTube channel. I really like the chart for this one. So we actually have an extremely strong core of investors here. In this case, we haven't been heavily shaken out over the summer at all. There were some projects that dropped 50, 60, even 70%, but here, ZigChain is holding up extremely well. We've also had a slight rebranding here. For a long time, it was purely an RWA project. Yes, the whole project used to be called Signally. Now, in this case, two narratives are being combined, both the original AI aspect and now new elements of RWA. We can take a look at all of this on the website, and there has definitely been solid development over the last few weeks, over the last few months. They also have a very, very strong presence at trade shows, conventions, etc. I actually even met this guy in Dubai at Token 49. As I said, I'm not paid, I have no affiliation with the project, but I did have a brief chat with the team, and they actually made a pretty good impression. So they really are delivering. We can also see here on Twitter that there's quite a buzz, so there's really a lot being posted, and very, very regularly. There have also been updates here. That's why I really like that they've taken a different direction here. We can also see here, enabling RWAs and SigChain. A few months ago, it was purely an AI project, and now in this case, we also have RWA components here, which of course covers two narratives at once. I definitely like it a lot. That's why it's a very good candidate that you need to keep a close eye on. Of course, it's still a bit risky because we're still relatively early here, so it's clear, high risk, high reward. You could consider making an investment. If, let's say, the price pulls back a bit again, there are definitely good entry opportunities, so there's definitely a clear relative strength here. The core group of investors is also present. Those are definitely positive aspects. Otherwise, the tokenomics are okay. It's in the green zone. It's neither catastrophic nor particularly impressive. 128 million compared to 177 million is fine, as I said. But still, the marketing is right and the product itself is definitely perfectly fine, especially since two narratives are covered here as well. That's all for ZigChain. Personally, just briefly, I actually didn't mention it. Personally, I don't have it in my own portfolio, but still, as I said, it's something to consider if the right prices are available. I'm definitely keeping a close eye on it. That's all for now. Now let's talk about a new AI project. To be completely honest with you, I really thought hard about this. Should I even include this AI project in the ranking, yes or no? Because it's probably one of the riskiest AI projects out there. It immediately goes under the lottery ticket category. It's incredibly small and right at the very beginning. You have to be extremely careful. Let's take a look at the whole thing. The whole thing is called QTC, Qubit Coin. This is a quantum computing project, so it's really exciting in terms of its use case. We can take a look at the chart here, but I recommend please don't look at CoinMarketCap because the data there is not up to date. The listing on CoinMarketCap was only added later. At this point, we need to take a look at SafeTrade. Personally, I had never used it before, but in this case, we have a chart from the very beginning, meaning since its creation. The project is completely new. In this case, it was only launched at the end of July. We also see here a market cap of just 5 million. Incredibly risky, but still, what I noticed here, there are some Casper whales and some Bitten Sortal whales who have invested in this project, which definitely gave me a positive impression. Here we have a project with a clear, unique selling point, powered by quantum proof of work. So the approach is definitely highly interesting, I have to say. The tokenomics are also very interesting, since it's based on proof of work, and in general, the narrative around quantum computing could become extremely, extremely exciting. That's why we've seen a really strong pump here in the meantime, but it's completely normal for such fresh, small projects to return to their origin. Currently, the origin is between $1.40 and $1.90. In this case, overall, it has dropped by 80% in the meantime. And here you can definitely see just how highly volatile and risky this project is. It's really a project that would fit perfectly into the zero or hero category. Either the project goes completely to zero and crashes entirely, or we see really high prices here, because it's also been partially bought up by Casper whales as well as Bittensour Tau whales. So I was definitely able to track quite a bit on chain. And the community here is also extremely strong, almost cult-like, I have to say. That's, I would say, also very interesting and something you rarely see, especially with small projects. There's also an incredible amount going on with this on Twitter, so feel free to check it out for yourselves when it comes to QTC. I don't really want to go into too much detail about it. I just wanted to mention it briefly because it actually came up as a topic in one of my live streams. It was also a short-term topic in my telecom community. That's why I wanted to bring it up. As I said, when it comes to tokenomics, the market cap compared to the fully diluted value obviously looks extremely catastrophic at first glance because the majority of tokens are not yet in circulation. But if you take a closer look at it, specifically at proof of work and tokenomics in general, you'll definitely notice that all the vesting periods are still extremely long. So the inflation isn't quite as severe as you might assume at first glance, but still. Of course, we're still going to experience a certain amount of inflation. A project like this is still completely at the beginning, and the longer the chart just drifts along, the worse it gets because of the inflation. But still, personally, I've built a tiny gamble position here at the $2 mark, so really very small in my own portfolio. I just wanted to mention it briefly. Be extremely careful. This is completely high risk, a total lottery ticket. Something like this could potentially create real competition even for major high cap projects. So something like this could theoretically really establish itself because it represents a unique narrative of quantum computing, but still, be extremely careful, and especially with a 5 million market cap, you can get burned very quickly. You can see it yourself from the chart. Yes, after a short time, minus 80%. The whole thing could drop another 80% as well. So be aware of this and only invest money that you can afford to lose. It's extremely important to mention that, and as I said, I'm not being paid, I have no contact with the project or anything like that. I definitely want to make that absolutely clear with such small projects, because of course the thought can quickly arise. So that's everything you need to know about this for now. Let's move on to the next project. I just want to mention it briefly, because it could actually be interesting if the retailers come back again. It's a relatively well-known meme, namely NPC. I think every one of you has heard this word before, NPC. It's also pretty well known as slang on social media. You see it again and again, and that's why I can easily imagine that there could be a comeback here. We saw an extremely strong chart here. So the chart was extremely potent back then in 2024, and also here during the November-December rally, where it was of course hit extremely hard, but that also affected almost every meme coin just as much. So we see a strong bleed out here due to the market situation, but still. Yes, we also see a clear reactivity to Ethereum here. So what I really like is that as soon as the market picks up again, as soon as Ethereum reaches new highs, we also see this meme coin gaining traction. Of course, there is a lot of material here regarding the meme itself. I don't want to go too much into detail. We're talking about a meme coin here. Still, it's interesting. Nevertheless, I have it on my watch list. The chart looks relatively good. Higher interim lows, higher interim highs, and something like this can easily reach a market cap of 500 or 600 million in a bull market. So I can definitely imagine that previous all-time highs could be reached again here, especially since the chart was so strong at the beginning. It was really enormous, and that's why there's definitely a chance that a potential comeback could happen here. Still, I'm not currently invested. That's okay. It's currently on my watch list. I'm keeping a very close eye on it. In general, when it comes to meme coins, a lot is on my watch list, but at the moment, this particular meme coin is not in my portfolio, just so you're aware. Still, I wanted to mention it because there is definitely potential here. Now, the next project is very exciting. I also find it extremely difficult to assess, and that's Nervous Network. Let's take a look at it here. I really like it from a technological standpoint. As is well known, it's a layer 1 with a very unique technological approach, so I have to say purely from a technological perspective, it's extremely exciting. That's why we've seen extremely strong pumps and a lot of hype here from time to time, but it has to be said that especially for layer 1 projects, things are extremely difficult because there are already so many layer 1 projects out there, basically their own blockchains. At the end of the day, you have to say that a layer 1 stands or falls with its applications. So how many people are actually using the blockchain? How much is actually being built on it, etc.? It doesn't help to have the fastest or the best technology or whatever if there are no real applications. And that's why personally I find it extremely difficult to assess such projects. I'm not invested. The overall package is definitely solid. The foundation it's built on is definitely healthy. We've given it good listings. They're delivering. So purely from a technological standpoint, as I said, things look very good, but still, I find it so hard to assess the whole thing. If you're convinced by the project, these are definitely beautiful entry opportunities right now. We're almost back to bear market levels here. We can see here that in 2022 and 2023, we settled in the range of 0.2 to 0.4 US dollar cents. We're now almost back in that range. So if you're convinced, these are currently good entry opportunities. Personally though, I'm a bit torn. I find it extremely difficult to assess layer 1 projects at the moment. Of course, it's all a bit dependent on the market, depending on what gets picked up. That's why, for me personally, it falls into the watch list category. I'm just keeping an eye on it at the moment, but I'm not invested here, just so you're aware. Next, the Project Turbo. I just want to mention it briefly as well. Especially when it comes to memes, I don't want to waste too much time, simply because you have to look at the topic of meme coins as a whole, since at the end of the day, you really do need to consider meme coins in their entirety. Either all meme coins are doing well and you see a meme coin season, or all meme coins are bleeding out. That's how it will be here over the summer as well. Still, in my opinion, Turbo has a small unique selling point. It is actually the first AI-generated meme coin. Of course, something like that benefits a meme coin. As I said, I'm not being paid or anything like that, but still. Yes, if a meme coin season happens, it's definitely one of my favorites, along with Mock and Pepe. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on at the moment. That's why it's definitely on my watch list. I might even buy in again, depending of course on what the chart does here. So at the earliest, I would maybe build a small position here at the 0.786 Fibonacci level, maybe a small long position. That's why I always put such projects on my watch list, just so you're aware. And with that, we come to the last project in today's video. It's crazy how long today's video has already gone on. And it's a completely new project that I personally find extremely exciting, namely Bio Protocol. Let's take a look at the chart here. We definitely saw that the launch timing was extremely unfavorable. Here on April 1st, we launched Bio Protocol and were accordingly hit extremely hard because the entire market, in this case, was bleeding out. We all saw it. The biggest crash of the altcoins happened since January, February, March. Then we saw a bit of a summer slump. So we definitely have a catastrophic chart here. It should also be mentioned that all the token unlocks are still fully in effect at the moment. If we take a look at the whole thing in the chart, we can definitely see that a strong wave of inflation is still coming our way. You definitely need to be aware of that. In my opinion, that's definitely a clear red flag for this project. So why did I still include this project in today's ranking? Simply because at the moment we're seeing a strong reactivity to Ethereum here, and because this is actually a completely new narrative. And that's why we have a clear first mover advantage here. We can take a look at the whole thing on their website. This is about the DC narrative, meaning decentralized science, your gateway drug to decentralized science. We can see it here on the website. In my opinion, the presentation is extremely strong. They're also delivering when it comes to marketing. So I can actually imagine that a new narrative could emerge here, where essentially all of science is brought onto the blockchain. And of course, that's a clear use case, decentralizing all of science, or more generally, scientific work in this case, including all the data, etc. And that's why there's a clear unique selling point here, and that's also why I wanted to include it in today's video, even though I would say from an overall perspective, it doesn't look all that great. When I take a look at the chart, it's honestly a bit shocking, almost catastrophic how it looks. Honestly, I really don't like investing in something like this, but we have definitely seen a bottoming phase take place, and the current reactivity compared to Ethereum is extremely strong. That's why I can easily imagine a new narrative forming here. Decentralized science is definitely highly exciting in my opinion, because there is a certain justification for this narrative as well. And as we all know, new narratives tend to do especially well. New narratives usually attract the most liquidity, I would say, in the crypto market. That's actually been the case quite often in the history of crypto. We've seen it with AI agents, we've seen it with meme coins. So there have always been new trends in the crypto market, and if you're one of the first to pick up on such a trend, it could be an exciting project here as well, even though the tokenomics and the chart haven't looked that good so far, I would say. But it's often the case that exactly these kinds of charts become particularly interesting after a bottoming phase, when the first signs of activity return, when the first structure starts to rebuild, and that's when you can find new entry points, maybe at 10 US cents. So I could definitely consider building a small position here. You definitely have to keep a close eye on it. Right now, it's of course completely risky. It's definitely on my watch list at the moment. As I said, I have a lot of projects on my watch list. That's why this category is also the most populated. But otherwise, you've now gotten a good insight here in part 2 of the coin ranking video. We definitely still have a lot ahead of us, so of course feel free to subscribe at this point. Definitely feel free to write in the comments, how would you have done the whole coin ranking? Which altcoin is even missing? Yeah, maybe I'll add something extra for the third part. And otherwise, of course, I'm definitely curious to hear your opinions. If you're completely new to the crypto market, I can also recommend Bitpanda to you here. I've linked it in the video description. I definitely use it for the fiat on and off ramp. Otherwise, for trading, I'm currently mainly using Bitunix. There's also currently a $400 bonus you can grab with the link in my video description. So now you're all up to date. Otherwise, I want to sincerely thank you for your attention. As I said, I've linked everything in the video description. You can also get all the indicators and so on completely free if you join my Telegram group. So you'll definitely be in the know at that point. Otherwise, as I said, thank you very much, and we'll see each other again in the next YouTube video.